The following is a podcast where expert practitioners and thought leaders share their insights and advice. A big thank you to all of you out there, our listeners. If you have any feedback or if you have a topic you'd like to hear about on this podcast, drop me an email at insights@securitycompass.com.
It's crucial to ensure that the problems that are identified as part of the threat model, and most importantly, the activities that are identified as required, are then inserted inside the backlog as work items, as tasks, as user stories, as stuff that is tracked and then implemented. Because otherwise, the threat model remains an exercise that is abstract, that doesn't provide any value.
You're listening to the Balancing Act podcast from Security Compass, your guide to going fast while staying safe in today's digital world. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's podcast of the Balancing Act from Security Compass. I'm your host, Altaz Valani. When we mention threat modeling, what often comes to mind are data flow diagrams created during a security design process. After these diagrams are created and eventually hit the developer backlog, we discover even more insights that further evolve the security design. In this way, developers are crucial to an evolving threat model activity. Today's podcast will focus on all of you developers out there. Thank you immensely for the great job you're doing. You have to stay up to date on evolving tools, frameworks, design patterns, services, best practices, and so much more. Today we're going to help you better understand what threat modeling is and how it intersects with your work. Joining me is Simone Curzi, who is no stranger to our podcast. Welcome to the podcast today, Simone.
Hi, thank you for having me.
For our listeners who may not know you, Simone, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background?
Of course. I'm Simone Curzi. I'm a principal consultant from Microsoft Services. I've been with Microsoft for about 23 years now, working on different roles, but my main interest area is application security in general and threat modeling in particular. So I work routinely with the customers and also internally to perform threat models and to assist in securing solutions.
That's amazing. Great job, and just keep up the good work on the security and the threat modeling side. And I think for today's podcast, what I'd like us to do is talk about some questions that a developer might have related specifically to threat modeling. And let's start off with just a very basic question, Simone. What is threat modeling? And are there different approaches to threat modeling?
That's a great question. Now, defining threat modeling may be easy. It's a process to better understand the security of the design of the system that is under scrutiny, and to identify how that system may become a target, may suffer from attacks, and what you can do to reduce the potential losses that you can face due to those attacks. There are various ways to do that, really a lot of different methodologies, but essentially the core of all of them is summarized by the Threat Modeling Manifesto, which is a summary of the main characteristics of what threat modeling is. And in a nutshell, threat model processes have four different phases that can be summarized by the four key questions. The first one is, what are we working on? Which is about understanding the system. And this is from my point of view, the most important part of threat modeling. The second step is to identify what can go wrong, and those are the so-called threats, how malicious actors can attack your system and can cause some damage to you or to your users and customers. The third step is what are we going to do about it? So it's about identifying activities that can be done to reduce the severity, that is the impact or the probability of facing some compromise or facing losses due to those attacks. And finally, the fourth is about validation. Did we do a good enough job? So this is about having iterative processes. Typically, you will not do threat modeling once and then essentially forget it. But in particular, when you are having agile approaches, iterative approaches, you would do threat modeling multiple times during the life cycle of the solution to ensure that your view of the system is maintained actual and that you are addressing also the new potential losses that could be defined, that could be a result of changes in the design of the solution.
Interesting. And we when we talk about threat modeling, historically it's been in the realm of security practitioners, and here we are talking about threat modeling in a developer context. So let me ask, as a developer, someone might be thinking, isn't threat modeling an activity only for security practitioners? Why are we bringing developers into this? Any thoughts?
Yes, there are different ways again to perform threat modeling, and currently there is a strong movement to ensure that the threat modeling is simplified and somewhat made more available also to other roles, not only to people with strong security experience. A very important idea, approach in that sense is the adoption of threat modeling as an activity, as a task, part of agile methodologies. So essentially, the idea is that threat modeling should not be an exercise performed by a security expert in isolation. Instead, you may have a security expert, but the role of the security expert will be mostly to guide the process. And the process, the responsibility for the process will be on the development team. And this includes not only the developers, but also the architects and also all the other people in the team. Of course, we are not talking about huge teams with hundreds of persons. We are talking about small, agile teams where you have 4, 5, 6 people working on a project. And the idea is to devote some time, could be a couple of hours, 3 hours, during each sprint to perform, to analyze a scenario, uh, a specific potential attack or a specific subsystem of the solution, and then together analyze it and identify how that could be exploited and identify what can be done to mitigate the risk. So this is an approach that could definitely be applied in that scenario.
Mm. Yeah, developers generally work with user stories or requirements. Can you talk a little bit? And I think you started to open up this conversation. What is the connection between my user stories or requirements, the coding activities I do, and the output from threat modeling as an activity? Threat modeling typically is a data flow diagram, but I work in user stories or requirements. How does that translation work? What's the connection between threat modeling and my requirements or stories?
That's a great question. It opens a lot of different topics to be to be analyzed. The first one is threat modeling is not a data flow diagram. The data flow diagram is nothing else than a way to represent our understanding of a system. So you may have different ways of representing that understanding, but the understanding per se is just a part of the threat model. So you needed to have some form of representation, could be even textual, could be an Excel file, could be whatever you want. Could be even a diagram done without a specific visual language on some whiteboard during a meeting. And that would have the intent of representing your understanding related to the system. So the idea is to leverage that understanding and then have a conversation related to how to address what are the potential problems, how to address them. But as you said, this is not useful per se to the development process. What is useful is to make actionable the activities that are identified as required during the threat model. So it's crucial to ensure that the problems that are identified as part of the threat model, and most importantly, the activities that are identified as required, are then inserted inside the backlog as work items, as tasks, as user stories, as stuff that is tracked and then implemented. Because otherwise, the threat model remains an exercise that is abstract, that doesn't provide any value.
Mhm. Will threat modeling make me a better developer?
Well, a threat modeler, yes, it may make you a better developer because it's about the mindset. Threat modeling is first and foremost a learning experience. If you start thinking as a threat modeler, if you start thinking about what can go wrong, you start also thinking, how can you develop defensively? How can you um, ensure that your solution is written in a way that is harder to compromise it? And there are books also describing this sort of approach for developers. For instance, you can um, write your code in a way that declares very clearly what you expect as input, and then you can validate in a strong way what you achieve, what you get, and then you can reject anything that is not aligned with expectations. You can log events, create alerts when this happens, and this is already a great way to protect your code and to ensure that it's more protected against potential attacks.
Hmm. As a developer, I may have come across this acronym called STRIDE. What is STRIDE? And does that help me as a developer or not?
Yes, Stride is two things really. The first one is the way Microsoft uses, or perhaps used, to classify the various potential threats. Uses or use it because there are different ways also inside Microsoft to classify threats, and still Stride is remains one of them. It's an acronym, and it stands for spoofing, which is when authentication is weak, and therefore you can have someone impersonating someone else. Then there is tampering, which happens when the integrity is at risk, and therefore you can change data that is transferred or where it is, for instance. Then repudiation, which happens when you can say, I didn't do that, and it's not possible to demonstrate otherwise. Then we have information disclosure, which is related to making information that is sensitive potentially available to people who should not have access to it. Denial of service, which is about availability. So when you limited availability of the data, and elevation of privilege, which is when you have potentially some rights over the solution, but you can exploit some vulnerability, or you can uh, abuse the system to get more rights than you should have. So this is essentially how the information has been categorized, and by extension, it has become also uh, a way to represent the process Microsoft uses to perform threat modeling. So when you were a stride based threat modeling or stride threat modeling, this is essentially the Microsoft approach based on stride classification.
Hmm. You know, as a developer, I often hear words like weakness or vulnerability or
Sure.
attack. Uh, are these synonymous? Are they one thing, the same thing? What's the difference between these things as far as a developer is concerned?
Well, there are various ways to classify the problems that you may face, or the potential ways to exploit those potential problems. One of the most important ways is to rely on the NIST classification definitions, or to MITRE definitions. And essentially, in accordance with that, when you talk about vulnerabilities, you are talking about bugs or problems inside software that can be exploited in some way. Weaknesses are essentially classification of those vulnerabilities. So if you have a specific piece of software that has a problem like an elevation of privilege vulnerability, so something that would allow you to get more rights than you should, that is a vulnerability in that software. But the elevation of privilege issue is as a classification of the problem, is a weakness. And in fact, there are a couple of databases for MITRE. This CVE is a database of the various vulnerabilities that you have in software, and you typically see the various vulnerabilities for software represented as a CVE code. And then there is this database linked with the CWE, which is associated to the weaknesses. So that's the common weaknesses enumeration. So E stands for enumeration. And then how those weaknesses, are those vulnerabilities used, abused, that's the threat. So it's how they can be exploited. And sometimes you may have multiple vulnerabilities combined together to allow some form of exploitation. Those the way those vulnerabilities are exploited are called threat events. So that this could be some
Hmm.
terms.
Right. And what we'll do is we'll put some links to what you just mentioned, Simone, in the
Sure.
podcast notes, and others can go in there and take a look further as well. Uh, Again, assuming I'm a developer, will I need to learn a new tool in my DevOps pipeline in order to do threat modeling?
Hopefully not. Uh, Again, threat modeling is typically done with your analysis, with your ability to understand the system. This is the main topic, the main point. And there are tools, of course, that you can use to facilitate the analysis and to identify what are the potential problems. But really, you don't need them necessarily. You can do meetings and use a whiteboard to simply track, understand the system and then identify the different problems. There are tools, though, that can accelerate this activity and can assist, even using automation. But you needed to understand that automation typically allows to introduce some knowledge related to the various services in a way that is focused on each service as a single isolated component. Sometimes the better tools allow to identify, to analyze a subsystem, a service in and how it interacts with its immediate subsystems. But it typically you do not have an holistic approach, an holistic analysis to the overall system. So this means that you can expect from those systems to have an identification analysis of your solution, considering its components, but you cannot understand, you cannot get from those systems an analysis of your solution from a wide point of view, or considering the business angle to the solution, what the solution itself is trying to achieve, and how that the system could be exploited. This is something that you can achieve only by understanding intimately the solution, and then by analyzing it using the threat modeling approach.
Hmm. Hmm. And you mentioned understanding of the system. We spoke earlier about the different knowledge bases that exist out there. Now, as a developer, I hear a lot about security weaknesses, but I simply don't have the time to keep up with all of these weaknesses on top of everything else that I need to think about. How would you respond to that type of comment?
Well, that's understandable. If you consider the solutions that a developer is developing normally, uh, security is rarely factored in. In many projects, what I've
Mhm.
seen is that typically the focus is on functional aspects, and this is normal. We need to move beyond that. We need to understand that security is an activity requiring some effort. If you develop a solution, you spend time ensuring that the availability is the one that is required by the solution itself to cover the scenario, or the performance. You spend time, you invest, you design the solution to be compliant with your requirements related to the performance. Why can't we do the same for security? Why cannot we work towards achieving the security of the solution? And this requires to analyze the solution, to design the solution to be secure. It requires to understand how it can be abused. It requires to design a monitoring infrastructure that is based on the capabilities provided by the infrastructure that is used. If you rely on the cloud service provider infrastructure, could be AWS, could be Azure, you would necessarily rely on auditing and monitoring infrastructure provided by the cloud service provider itself.
Mhm.
And sometimes you may want to use the capabilities as they are without thinking that you need to do stuff. It's not only about enabling the capabilities provided by the infrastructure. You need also to consider your solution to factor that in. Let me give you an example about that. Solutions like, for example, a web application, they typically handle information. You have some input information, data, and then you process that data, that information. This information that you get is typically transparent to the infrastructure. The infrastructure is generic, it doesn't know anything about that. But your application must process the data. It should know what sort of information, what sort of data is received. So your application should know if you expect to receive a phone number or tax ID or something like that, and what is the structure of the information you receive. So it's your responsibility to include validation in your code to ensure that this input you're receiving is correct. And then to do stuff if the input is not correct, like raising an alert if you receive something that it, doesn't sound right. So in many cases, I've seen this is not done. And the result is that you get just part of the understanding of the system. So, bottom line to your question, yes, that's true. Security is expensive, and we wanted to use automation. We wanted to use mechanisms to cut the cost for security because security is a cost. It doesn't provide value that is tangible. But the value that it provides is that it allows to reduce the risk. It allows to reduce the potential losses that can be seen as a result of a compromise of the solution. So automation is a way to limit, but at the end of the day, what I think is that you need to invest a little on security to have secure solutions.
Mm-hmm. And you talked about the cross-functional nature of how threat modeling works as well. So I have one last question for you, Simone. What is your advice for me as a developer to stay current on threat modeling? Maybe I'm now interested to embark on becoming a security champion, or I'd like to work better with my security team. So what advice would you offer me to stay current on just around this threat modeling domain?
Well, I can tell you what has worked for me, and it is get experience. So try to use the threat modeling approach as soon as possible and try to apply that to each engagement you work on every time, every day, not necessarily on your project as a developer only, but you can apply threat modeling also on real life and other scenarios. Try to understand the systems, the scenarios, what you live, and what are the potential risks, what can go wrong, what you can do to prevent, detect, and respond to those risks. Apply that and learn by doing. This is definitely the most important recommendation. Experience is fundamental. And another recommendation related to that is to understand that everyone has gone through the same process. So do not be scared when you start. You shall try and you will make mistakes. You will not be perfect, but you will still produce some value. And the next time you will provide even more value. So threat modeling is a continuous learning experience, first and
Yeah.
foremost.
It's a great advice there. And this has been a tremendous conversation, Simone. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, your insights, your expertise with our listeners. And I just also want to thank you, all our listeners, for taking the time to listen to this podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at Security Compass. You can follow us on LinkedIn. You can follow Simone on LinkedIn. You could go to his blog site as well. We will have the link available for you in the podcast notes. With that, I wish all of you a safe and a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you.
The thoughts and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speaker and do not necessarily reflect those of their organization.